Welcome, welcome. My name is Lacey Hensley. I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. I'm joined today with Maya Pridgeon, our program manager of ICCR, and we're super excited to have with us today a longtime friend of the conference, Dr. Patrick Brady. Yay! Glad to have you, Patrick. So excited you're here. Will you go to the next slide for me, please? Thank you. For those of you that don't know, ICCR is a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women. We also are funded through the Office of Violence Against Women through their rural program, technical assistance provider. So, of course, we have our little disclaimer here that anything we talk about today is not the opinions or conclusions or recommendations expressed for the Department of Justice. So now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, Patrick, I am going to turn it over to you, but know that folks, if y'all have questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A, sometimes the chat. You're welcome to participate in the chat. We love that, but sometimes questions get a little lost in the chat. So if you want to make sure your question is answered, please put it in the Q&A and we will help monitor that and let Patrick know what questions come up. All right. Turning it over. Thanks for being here.
All right. Well, hello. Thank you for hanging out with me on Thursday. So my name is Patrick Brady. I'm a criminologist and professor at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. And today I'm excited to talk to you about some of the research I've been working on, and particularly a project where I was able to spend my summer riding around with police officers, watching how they implemented lethality assessments on scene. I'm going to talk about some of the findings from that, but also the work that has continued with my interviews with other individuals that are responsible for implementing lethality assessment programs. And so, kind of what I just wanted to cover today is just kind of a brief overview about what lethality assessment protocols or programs are and how they work, and also the research behind them. Yeah.
Patrick, we had someone comment saying that you're echoing. I don't know if anybody else is getting an echo. I don't know. Okay. No, not okay. Sorry about that. Just want to make sure. Thank you.
No worries. Am I still echoing? Oh, let me
I
go
think
back.
I think you're good
Okay.
as far as I
Let,
can tell.
let me know if that changes. So then I want to talk about how the lethality assessment program works in practice. And then specifically talking about, so I was specifically looking at victim participation. So what influences a victim to want to complete a lethality assessment and then also speak to the advocate, but also what are the situational conditions of incidents where victims are most likely to say no. And by understanding kind of those dynamics, how can we be more proactive and still respecting victim autonomy and their decisions to answer these questions, but also how we can be better about kind of framing what we're doing. And the more that we are being transparent about what the assessment is and what an advocate is and what they can do for victims, we are becoming much more, we're giving victims all the information that they need to make much more informed decisions when they are on scene in some of these chaotic moments. And then I also wanted to look at if a victim refuses to complete a lethality assessment, how does that impact the trajectory of a case after an arrest? Does that send signals to a prosecutor that this is going to be a victim that is unwilling to participate? And with that, maybe that might influence decisions moving forward. And so I did some analyses to determine how the lethality assessments impact case outcomes in a ruralish community. So when we are talking about lethality assessments, what we've known is that pretty much men had been murdering their partners for centuries, and they tend to, and research has showed that they tend to do it in the same way. So now we have some pretty robust research that shows us kind of what are the key predictors of men's femicide or men perpetrating femicide, which is the killing of women. And so this is a meta-analysis from 17 studies of intimate partner homicides. And what a meta-analysis does is it is a statistical technique that basically allows us to comb all of the research and identify what are some of the strongest predictors of a specific outcome. And so in these cases, the outcome was intimate partner homicide. And then these are all the behaviors that and aspects of the relationship that were present that influenced homicides. And so that's why we're asking about the direct access to guns, non-fatal strangulation, stalking, threats to harm the victim. And so these have been adapted to a number of different lethality assessments. And so this is an example of the one that was used in the community that we did the research in. And so this is the lethality assessment program developed by the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. And so this is a specific protocol where officers will ask, so in any situation where there is an intimate partner, they will identify the victim and ask them a series of these questions depending on their answers. So if they answer yes to one or more of the first three, they're automatically screened in as high risk. And that's because threats with a weapon, belief that they might kill them, and strangle and choking, those are some of the more stronger predictors of homicide. And so those automatically score them in. Or if they say yes to four or more of the 4 through 11 there, that classifies them as high risk. But there are some situations where victims they either say no to everything or they don't want to do the assessment, but the officer is concerned about their safety. And so there is an option for officers to categorize victims as high risk based off their belief. And so this is one particular protocol that we now know tends to actually have some research behind it. We don't have a ton of research on it, which makes me nervous as a criminologist, the fact that we are just kind of adopting these kind of widespread. Colorado just passed a law that's now requiring every law enforcement agency to engage in some type of lethality screening. And while I'm pro lethality screening, sometimes these laws look great on paper, but are actually kind of challenging to implement in practice. And so, what we know about the lethality assessments is that they actually do a pretty good job at predicting which victims are actually at a higher risk for intimate partner homicide and or severe domestic violence. And we there's research that shows that these tend to outperform kind of gut instincts. It's great in terms of connecting victims to advocates because that's part of the protocol. And we also know that victims tend to have a lot more satisfaction and are more willing to participate when we can connect victims to advocates who are navigating the criminal justice system. There's only one study that looked at does a high risk domestic violence team does that actually increase prosecution and conviction rates? And a study found that it didn't. With that. But again, we really only have one study, and we also don't really have a whole lot of research on how the downstream decisions that are coming from these lethality assessments. And so that's something I'm actually working on this summer. Is we are interviewing prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys in Colorado about this new law that is coming into play and whether or not they are already using the information from a lethality assessment, and if so, how. And then also just looking at some of the, like, what do defense attorneys think of these lethality assessments? What's kind of like I said earlier is we have a lot of unknowns with this. We don't necessarily know why victims refuse. And also, it can also come down to an officer effect. And what I learned watching cops is that officers tend to implement lethality assessments in all different ways. And we'll talk about that. And so there are still a lot of unknowns in terms of figuring this out. But also in terms of how this information is being used downstream, whether that is influencing charging decisions, are judges using it for pretrial conditions or sentencing conditions, uh, looking more into that. So just what we know in terms of some of the research with the at least the LAP, Maryland Network found about half of victims screen in high risk for lethality. And this was designed on purpose. And so sometimes these lethality assessments can actually overscreen. And that they argue is a good thing because we'd rather, overscreen people who are scoring high risk, but it may not, actually increase the risk for future homicide. It's better to overscreen than miss victims and underscreen. Others have looked at the victims and why they talk to advocates. And so we also see that there are some victims that about half are going to decline to talk to an advocate. Not every single victim is going to access victim services. And so that's important to kind of understand these decision points in terms of better understanding how the decisions are being made and what is influencing those decisions, both from victims in terms of their participation, but also how officers are bringing this up and essentially framing the lethality assessment, and are they actually educating victims about their level of safety. So I created this chart for you just to help you understand that there are a ton of different lethality assessments out there. The good news is that all of them tend to have good predictive validity, is what we call, and so like all of them are pretty good at screening for high risk. But each tool has a different type of protocol, and it's designed for different individuals. And so a lot of agencies will use the lethality assessment protocol, which is the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. They're using kind of an adapted version of the dangerous assessment that was developed by Becky Campbell. And that was really designed to help as a screener for high risk victims that are seeking medical services. And so it's since been adapted to help with high risk domestic violence teams, but also in terms of screening victims on scene. So other agencies are using the DALE, and so I have this in terms of like what it's really looking at, who it's for, and what it's based off the information about. And so some are actually more offender focused. And so they are trying to identify the most prolific domestic violence offenders in the community. And that's more like the ODORA, SARA, the DVSI R. If anybody would like any of the research studies, please let me know. I'm happy to get those for you. And then also, I will send out my PowerPoint so that you have access to this after. Also, you're more than welcome to take photos of the screen. I don't have any sensitive information on here or anything like that, but I want to make sure that you can get access to that. But just know that there are a ton of different lethality assessments, and the ones that you use, it's important to kind of understand what they're designed for, and to ensure that they are being used correctly. So, for example, the lethality assessment program, that is really designed to identify high risk victims and get them connected to advocates in the moment. What they argue is that it's not really designed for charging decisions or offender dangerousness and things like that, because the information is coming from the victim standpoint. But also, it's designed to kind of over identify people who may be on that threshold of high risk. In addition to those that are absolutely at that threshold of high risk for homicide or more serious violence. And so they argue that it's not really designed to be used as a charging tool and things like that. But we do know that prosecutors are using lethality information in general. And so that's why I wanted to do that study this summer, to figure out kind of how are prosecutors using this, how are judges using this, what are defense attorneys think of these lethality assessments if they're trying to challenge them or use the information at all in their sense. This is just another slide just to show you like kind of the goals of their protocols. And so some are to connect. So the way that sorry, this is what it is. To identify the high risk victims, connect them to victim advocates on scene. Also, it's important to educate the victims about their risk for lethality. And so when we've looked at some of the research on this so far, that seems to be a part of the protocol that officers don't always engage in. So some victims that were interviewed after said that they were never told what their score was, or the officer never conveyed concern for their safety in that. And so, but that is a key component of these lethality assessments, is to help victims understand that, hey, we have this, validated tool that helps us better understand and identify people who are at a higher risk for injuries or severe violence. And so if they score in that high risk category, officers are supposed to convey their concern to those victims, and then encourage them to speak to an advocate. And then the officer is supposed to call the hotline, kind of convey to the advocate what's going on, what the score is, and then the advocate will also convey their concern for their safety and then help with safety planning and any of the immediate resources that victims need on scene. And so again, while all this looks great on paper, it is a lot more complicated in the process of it actually happening. So that's the background in terms of what these protocols are. A lot of them are designed to identify these high risk victims and then connect them to victim advocates. but also to let you know that there are other assessments that are more focused on identifying perpetrators, identifying couples that would be good for a high risk team to monitor, and to do more proactive work. And so, if you are doing a community coordinated response or a multidisciplinary team, there are some assessments that could be beneficial to screening cases and identifying the ones that are going to create the most havoc in your community in terms of dangerous perpetrators.
Hey,
And so,
Patrick.
yes,
Sorry, really quickly. There's lots of folks interested in the studies, that you in getting the studies. So why don't we just plan on putting some of that information on the website with the recording?
yeah,
So if you're putting,
absolutely.
yeah, no need to put your email in the chat. We will make that available on the website next week with the recording. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll send those studies along. Cool. I like that people are interested in that. All right, so we talked about how it kind of works in practice. So now I want to talk about my summer watching cops and looking at it in terms of how does this lethality assessment protocol get carried out? So I was able to apply for an LEV grant through the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Justice Resource Network. And so they were able to fund a project that allowed me to move to Washington for 6 weeks and work with the Yakima Police Department to better understand victim participation in the lethality assessments. And so I moved there and I went on ride alongs generally from Tuesday through Saturday. Um, and I worked with the crime analyst to identify the times of day and days of week where most of the calls for service for domestic violence occurred, and also where they were scoring high risk victims when those were going. And so I was very strategic about how I went on these ride alongs. Because what I've learned as a criminologist is that police officers don't always love someone else in their car, especially someone who has a clipboard and is asking a lot of questions. And so it was my role to really not get on any officer's nerves and to allow them to do their job, and to make the ride along with me as easy as possible. And luckily, I had zero problems. Every single officer I rode with was just a wealth of information, and just it was very cool to be able to spend the summer getting to know the officers both as people, but also their perceptions on domestic violence laws, how they handle these cases, the struggle of the challenges of implementing these lethality assessments, what they knew about the lethality assessments, what recommendations they had. And so it was a really good opportunity to get firsthand experience. And I felt very lucky to be able to do this. And so shout out to Yakima, because this is also a community that has been doing a lethality assessment program for quite some time. And so this is a well-oiled machine where both the officers and the advocates have been working together for a while. And now even Yakima has an in-house advocate that also does a great job, Kirsten, who is also kind of a third party or a third connection to really make sure that we are connecting high-risk victims to either a community or a system-based advocate, just letting these high-risk victims know that there is support and resources in the community for them. So just a little bit of background about this, the community and the study. I'll show you some of the stuff that I did, but in generally, this is a medium to large size police department, but it is in an area that's classified as rural. And so I do want to point that a lot of these findings that we're talking about today are really unique to this community. But I designed this webinar to really be for people who are already implementing a lethality assessment program, are about starting to, or are just interested in how these programs work and what are some things to consider. And so a lot of the kind of takeaways are really about the implementation process, and how we can really improve our response, but also improve how we are training officers, because officers are the ones that are carrying these out. And so a key aspect is getting officer buy-in, because we are asking them to do paperwork. And as you know, officers don't always love paperwork. But Yakima is a really interesting community. It used to be a large transient population, because they do produce like 85% of the hops in the United States. And hop season is generally, I think, like August through October. And so around the fall, they would have a lot of migrants coming up for work. But now that it is such an agricultural community, they do have a lot of migrants living there permanently. And so a lot of the officers that I rode around with were the Spanish speaking officers who were able to go around to the different jurisdictions. So they every shift they would always sign me a domestic violence officer, and that was just a regular patrol officer who. When they had the opportunity, could get me to a domestic violence or a call for service in that case. And so usually that was the Spanish speaking officer because they were able to go into different beats to be able to be a translator. And so some days were great. Some days we would get caught up on a DUI and that would take us 2.5 hours. And it was very eye opening in terms of how many calls that officers get that they do a ton of work to investigate that turn out to be not really anything. So it was great also as a policing scholar to get a better understanding of the realities of what officers deal with on a regular basis, both in and outside of the domestic violence cases. So for this project, I went on 20 ride-alongs. I conducted about 150 hours of observations, and so the special assault unit within the Yakima Police Department also let me shadow their detectives and do focus groups with their domestic violence detectives to get a better understanding of kind of what did they do once the patrol officers turned the case over. And then I also wanted to track case outcomes. And so I took a random sample of 200 arrests that happened over a 2 year period. And then me and my grad students painstakingly dug through this online repository in Washington in order to kind of track the case outcomes to see whether or not participation in that lethality assessment was related to charging and conviction decisions. And so so I worked with their crime analysts and they gave me 2 years. I took a random sample of 1,500 cases. And then from those, I tried to get all of the lethality assessments for each case. And that turned out to be about 900 lethality assessments. And I analyzed that data in addition to the court outcome. Right. So this is just kind of a background of the types of cases that we were dealing with. So on average, victims were about the same age. And we had a lot of same race couples. So most of them, over half of them were Hispanic. Most of our couples were male perpetrators of female victims. But we did have female perpetrators of male victims. And then we also had same sex victims and same sex relationships in this. Washington is a mandatory arrest state. And so about 60% of these cases resulted in an arrest, which is about on trend with national estimates. About 50% of domestic violence calls result in an arrest. And so this is right there kind of with the national estimates as well. What was also really interesting is this particular police department, any interaction that they have with someone, they get a unique ID number. And so whether that is a witness on scene to the victim to the suspect, everyone gets a unique ID number. And so being a data nerd, I wanted to see how many times those numbers showed up in this random sample of calls. And so what we found was about 40% of these cases were repeat victims and suspects, meaning that they had two or more interactions, two or more IPV related interactions with the police. And so these were all these were all tagged as IPV calls. So they could have had many more run-ins with the police for like a theft or a burglary. I just had IPV calls. So these are two or more domestic violence related encounters with the police. And so with that, I was also able to connect the victim ID and the suspect ID to look at repeat couples, and that was about 1 in 3 of these individuals. And so this speaks largely to the idea that our interactions with victims, it's likely that for the most part, we may never see them again. But in this particular community, they did encounter these victims multiple times, specifically for domestic violence related situations. Additionally, I was also able to link offender IDs to other victims. And so that's where we were able to estimate kind of serial offenders. So these were individuals that had two or more different victim IDs attached to their suspect ID. So these were individuals that had multiple calls for domestic violence, but not always with the same victim. And then we also saw for serial victims as well is that there were some victims that had multiple IPV related encounters, but with different perpetrators. And then in about 11% of these cases, the repeat encounter, the roles had switched. So in one case, they were identified as the victim, and then in the next case, they were identified as the suspect. And then we had high frequency victims and offenders and couples. And so these are individuals and couples that had three or more IPV related encounters with the police over a 2 year period. So this just goes to show that repeat victims do exist. And so that also opened up to this idea that I wanted to look at is, well, if a victim refuses the first time, do they always refuse with every encounter? And no, the answer is it changes. It's very situational. But what I am finding in some preliminary analysis is that the more interactions a victim has, the less likely that they are going to complete the lethality assessment and speak to a victim, especially if they've already talked to a victim advocate before. Um, so the reality of these lethality assessments is that we quickly realized is that in about 40% of the calls, there was the lethality assessment was not implemented, and not because officers just didn't do it. In about 17% of these calls, there were situations where officers were just unable to be able to implement the assessment. So that could be because the victim is unavailable, because sometimes the victims were unconscious or had to be transported to medical. Sometimes they wouldn't be on scene. Other times there was a dual arrest. And so in this agency, they don't do the lethality assessment because both individuals would get arrested, but also the agency discouraged dual arrests. And so it was a very small percentage of dual arrests. Others, the case started as a result of a jailhouse phone call, so they didn't complete a lethality assessment. But a lot of them were either language barriers or specifically tech related behavior. So in this agency, they actually document the lethality assessment and their strangulation supplement on an app on their phone. And so there were times where we would be on scene and the officers would go through the lethality assessment and then they would click submit and then they would get an error. And so I saw this firsthand in terms of, so sometimes, as agencies are adapting to the use of technology, we have to account for that there are going to be some tech related issues that come with that adaptation. So very similar to the previous research on in Maryland, about half of these cases screened in as high risk for homicide. And this is kind of the breakdown of the question. So about 40% of them were scored high risk based off answering yes to the first three questions. So about 40% of them said yes, that they have been threatened with a weapon or believe the suspect will kill them, or they have been strangled in the past. And then about 30% of them said yes to four or more of the 4 through 11 cases with this. In terms of getting connected to an advocate, and so on the way that the app documents everything is it documents whether or not the officer was unable to complete the screen, whether or not the victim refused to answer the questions, whether the officer contacted the hotline, and whether they connected the victim with the advocate. So out of those that screened, about half of them were screened high risk. About 67% were connected to an advocate. However, there were a lot of cases where officers wouldn't complete the last parts. And so this isn't necessarily officers not connecting victims to advocates. It's more of a documentation issue. And so this is important because, for example, in Colorado, with the passage of this new law that is requiring every law enforcement agency to do a lethality assessment and connect them to a community advocate, but also to document how many lethality screens that we're doing and how many victims we're connecting to advocates. So that is now going to be a requirement that agencies have to document this. And so in this particular agency, they would complete everything and then just not document whether or not they connected them to a victim advocate. So that was part of the protocol. So if they scored high risk, officers would connect them to the advocate. It just didn't get documented. So that creates a big issue in terms of the data aspect of it, and that without of the cases that I actually had data showed that only about 28% of those victims were connected to an advocate based on the data. So we don't necessarily know this huge chunk of victims that scored high risk, but then there was no outcome documented for that. And so as much as we try to triangulate and find in the files to see if we could figure out if they were connected to an advocate, some of the information was just missing. And that is kind of the nature of working with official data from police departments. And so this is something that they've definitely have kind of corrected as a result of this project, which has been great. And why I'm thankful for this agency to let me come in and help them understand kind of what's working, what's not working, and how we can kind of improve that process along the way. And so we really learned from this is that that documentation is important because otherwise it looks like there's a huge chunk of high risk victims that are not being connected to advocates. Right. So now I want to talk about does anybody have any questions so far about anything that I've talked about before we get into kind of officers' experiences and their approaches to implementing the lethality assessment? Right. So the first thing that's important to kind of understand is the training component of the lethality assessment. And so when I talk to officers, a lot of them would tell me that. So in terms of my training, it was really from my FTO or my field training officer telling me that I had to do this. And so some of that training comes with, and here's why we do it. And then others got kind of just 10 minutes in a roll call or their muster, basically being like, hey, this is a lethality assessment that's going to help prevent homicide. We need you to complete this out. Complete it. If they score high risk, connect them to the local advocacy center. And that was kind of the extent of their training. And so with that, a lot of officers were saying like, yeah, a lot of the officers didn't necessarily complain about it, especially the newer officers, because one, a lot of them argued, it's like, well, I don't really know what it was like before this, and so for me it's not a big deal. I can just kind of do the questions, and that it's just part of the policy, so that's how we just carry it out. And so a lot of the officers are very just by the book and being like, this is what the policy says, so we just do it. But with that, a lot of the officers are saying like, but sometimes I don't necessarily know why I'm asking the questions or why certain questions are on there, or I don't like asking these questions because they're kind of blunt, and sometimes the situation is it doesn't really seem appropriate for me to be asking these questions. So a lot of the questions related to, like, why are we asking these? What do we do in what they called verbal? So these were calls where they responded, but there wasn't probable cause for an arrest. And so at that point, they're doing mediation and trying to problem solve the situation. But in those calls, they don't really have a victim and a suspect. They have two complainants that they contacted, and there's not any visible injuries. There's no probable cause for any other type of crime. And so these are tagged as verbal calls. And so officers mentioned like, well, we don't necessarily know how to really kind of navigate those because I don't have an identified victim. So sometimes officers would just be like, I'll just go with her because she's the one that called. And so, and then some officers, it wasn't always just she, it was like whoever called the police, like that's who they identified as the complainant and would have them complete the assessment. And then there were some cases where officers had both of them complete the assessments in that case. And so that also led to questions of, well, what do you do when both parties are scoring high risk? Do officers connect both of them to the advocate? And then that's going to raise questions when you have same sex cases where maybe both are scoring high. Say you have two women that are scoring high risk for lethality. And so we might have a women's shelter. And so that requires kind of cooperation, coordination with the local agency to see how do we how do we handle situations where the victim becomes the suspect, vice versa, or when we have these lethality assessment protocols that are required and both parties are scoring high, how do we deal with that? And then also, they said that they didn't really get any guidance for reluctant victims. Sometimes the victims are just straight up like, no, I don't want to answer those questions. And others, they can definitely tell that they're kind of on the fence. And other times, officers are just kind of like, they said no, so I'm just not going to push it. Also, because they're using their situational awareness, and sometimes, like, that sometimes we'd get there and the victim absolutely was not the one that called the police. And so they were mad that we were there. And so some officers picked up on that and saying like, she's already upset that we're here. So I'm not going to ask her these questions because she's just going to tell us no anyway. Or they would, and the victim would tell us like, no, absolutely not. And then there were other kind of situations that were kind of brought up. So this was saying like, I wish we knew why certain questions were being asked. So a lot of them had questions about why are we asking about a non-biological kid in the home, and that's actually a lethality factor that was identified with Becky Campbell's work back in the early 2000s. And it's also a strong predictor of child abuse in the home is when you have a non-custodial adult living within the home. And the argument is that sometimes a non biological child can be the source of a lot of arguments and disagreements between the adult couples. And then the child abuse aspect of it is it's not their biological child. And so they tend to have. If the child is acting up, then that tends to upset them a lot more and things like that. And so and then also a lot of them are saying like, you know, after we do the assessment, like I don't really know what happens. And so I just some of the officers even mentioned that like they're like I assume it's for grant purposes, like to say like how many that we did. But they didn't know that this was actually being tracked by their crime analysts. And this particular police department, they have a lethality assessment dashboard that's open to the public to show them exactly kind of the prevalence of each question and things like that. That's open to the general public for them to be able to check. But some of the officers didn't even know that that's what the information was for. They thought it was more for just like grant related purposes. This is talking about the verbals if there's no crime or we don't really have a victim and a suspect. How do we handle that? And then, like I said, if they don't always want to cooperate, it's kind of hard moving forward. I'm actually going to change this so I can see what slides. There we go. Okay. All right. So, in terms of the first lesson for my summer watching cops, what I've learned is that in order to make these successful, one, we're going to need victims to participate. But in order to get victims to participate, we need to make sure that officers know what they are doing and why they're doing it. And also to show them kind of the fruits of their labor. I'm saying you have to do it, you know, providing them with visions of like, oh, so this is an assessment rooted in research. These are the things that we know can increase someone's risk for severe violence. And so we do this as a proactive across all. And so that we are doing this so that we can track that information. But at the same time, uh, these state mandates and mandates in general, like we have to provide
Yeah,
with the
Patrick,
some that brings up the yes.
you're cutting out. I think you're frozen.
And we're also getting the presenter view of the presentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we lost him.
Do a primary aggressor determination. The primary victim is not supposed to be asked their consent. It's supposed to be done as regular police procedures, regular police investigation about uh, the circumstances and prior domestic violence, not as a separate thing. Victims are supposed to be, at least this is the way the lab protocol is written and tested. And then the police officer is supposed to be asked the questions, tell the victim if they are at high risk to be killed. And also, they are those that are at high risk on the lap are supposed to be put in touch with a local domestic violence hotline operator if they want to talk to them. But the police officer is supposed to make the call and then offer the victim the phone. In our evaluation in Oklahoma, what we found was that victims, female victims who actually talked to a domestic violence hotline operator were much more likely, significantly more likely to be in touch with domestic violence advocacy the next day, the next week. They were also had significantly less repeat domestic violence incidents and significantly more use of protective actions. Um, so, it's complicated. Police definitely need more training than they get in a 10-minute roll call, but that's expensive to provide that. And so, there really needs to be buy-in from the police department, and how are they going to provide some training? Are they going to provide training at the police academies in the LAP in states and jurisdictions that are using it? Uh, the Dale also has basically the same questions, and it was developed to make a determination on which cases should be on a high risk team. Um, this kind of research, like Patrick did, is awesome and important. And I would just recommend that we have more conversations about this.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I really, really appreciate you just on the spur of the moment coming in to help us out and answer some of those questions. So, welcome back, Patrick.
That's why I shouldn't be allowed to touch anything. So, okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so we can go into some how I was also curious in how officers would bring up the lethality assessment. And so a lot of the interviews I had with officers and my observations, I would ask them like, hey, so can you kind of walk me through how, when, and why you implement the lethality assessment? And so in this agency, they have a policy that says anytime they have an interaction with intimate partners, or that based off that relationship, based off the RWC, um, that they are required to do the lethality assessment. But there isn't anything; they don't have a formal policy that outlines how to do it. And so a lot of the officers would mention that. Well, I usually don't bring it up until after the person has been arrested, or definitely out of earshot of the suspect. And then a lot of them talked about whether or not they framed or how they framed the lethality assessment. And there were variations in that. And so, like, for example, so some of the officers, they would tell me, you know what, I actually don't tell them about it. I just start asking the questions because usually when I give them the whole preamble about what they're doing, like they always say no. And so some officers said that they had a better chance of getting the information by just asking the victims the questions. Others used it as an investigative tool. And so some of the more seasoned officers, they've been doing this for a few years in terms of asking lethality assessments. So like they know what those 11 questions are. And so when they're interacting with the victim, they're remembering key things that the victim is saying and kind of making a note in their head so that they don't have to re-ask the question in that. And then others would use it as an investigative document. So when they said yes to being strangled, then officers would say, that's great, because then I would ask them a lot more questions about that so that I could document that in the report. But across the board, officers did it in all different ways, which I would argue I get it, because even, doctors and nurses, they have their own bedside manner in terms of how they implement policies. And so something that I think we need to really be looking at in the future is to figuring out, what are the best ways to bring up this lethality assessment, and how can we do it in trauma-informed ways? Because a lot of the officers talked about how they didn't feel like it was appropriate for them to be doing the lethality assessment, because in a lot of these cases, like, these calls are complicated. They are very stressful. They are intense. And sometimes, you have a victim that is in complete shock. And so officers are confused about being like, they're already traumatized. And now I kind of have to ask them these like really sensitive personal questions about their relationships. And so some of them would argue that, like, we think that the domestic violence detective should do this on the follow-up, without some officers recognized they understood the golden hour in terms of the victim that we're dealing with on scene is not always the victim that we're dealing with during the follow-up. But a lot of the officers are saying like because they're so traumatized, that it might be better for the detectives to do it. But then when I asked the detectives like, do you think that you should be doing the lethality assessment? They argued that we should do it if it wasn't done, but ultimately no, they should be doing it on scene because that's when victims are going to be the most likely to participate. This is a quote that I pulled from a lethality assessment study that was over in Connecticut, talking about a victim advocate. And I included it in this just because I thought it was a really good way to kind of describe a lot of what the officers were telling me. So this is an advocate talking about once they have identified a high risk victim, they're saying, we get on the phone with the victim and whatever happened is just so jarring that they don't want to speak to us. They kind of just shut down. They're in shock. You talk to them, you try to give them as much information as you can, but they recognize that they're not always absorbing anything that's going on. And this was really interesting too. In cases we had like an aggravated assault situation where the woman she had visible injuries. It was a pretty intense situation, and when the officer was asking her the lethality questions, the officer was saying like, "Have you ever been threatened? Have you ever been strangled?" And the victim was confused, and she was like, no, he hit me like in the face several times. Like he didn't strangle. Like, why are you asking? Like he didn't do that. So the victim didn't recognize that the officer was asking questions about their relationship overall. The victim thought the officer just kept asking her questions about things that happened that night. And she was confused, being like, no, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. So the officer recognized, he's like, no, I'm talking about it as like overall. We had another situation where they were asking about separation, and the victim was like, well, we're separated right now because he doesn't want to be arrested. And the officer is like, what do you mean by that? She's like, well, he left the house because he doesn't want to be arrested. And the cop was like, no, I'm asking you, like, have you had a history of separation? Like, have you guys broke up before? And she was like, oh, yes, we have. She thought the separation question was about on scene. So it just points to the idea that we need officers to have a better understanding of kind of the dynamics of these situations and the challenges that can come up with it. Another challenge that came up with was the presence of children. And so this varied. So a lot of the officers were saying like, sometimes it's really awkward. I get it. Like the victim has just been through something traumatic, and the kiddos around them like our sense of support. And sometimes the child is being the translator and things like that. And so officers would try to bring up the idea like, hey, so I need to ask you some questions that might be sensitive. Like, do you want to go into another room? And sometimes when I saw it on there, like they're like, no, I want to be, next to my children and stuff like that. And then they would ask them the questions in front of the children about the relationship with the partner. And some victims would just say no to everything, but the officers never knew if that was because like they don't want the kids to know what was like the history of the abuse. And then sometimes the victims would say yes to everything, not necessarily in the presence of children, but some officers brought that up in terms of like sometimes if they say yes to everything, that's going to influence us to make the arrest. And across the board, officers would argue that no, the arrest doesn't. If there's an arrest, that doesn't influence my decision to categorize them as high risk, because normally we've already made the decision to make an arrest, and that person is being arrested before we actually implement the lethality assessment. And so this was just some things to pay attention to in terms of how do we help officers kind of navigate the idea of children as support systems, but also, not always asking these sensitive questions in front of the children that they then begin to understand kind of the history of the abuse. One of the main barriers and why I didn't put it in a lot of the data is because officers didn't always document the discoverability aspect of it. And so these assessments become part of an investigation, especially if an arrest takes place. And so as a result, these are a supplemental document that becomes discoverable. So if charges are referred to a prosecutor, they file charges, then the defense is going to get everything in discovery, including this lethality assessment. And so the officers would describe, hey, so I'm about to ask you some questions. Just know that like he or she may be able to like hear what you said about these cases. And so that, especially if you have a victim that is in a coercive controlling situation, they don't want the perpetrator to know what they told the police. And so a lot of them would just say, no, I don't want to answer those questions. And then sometimes the officers didn't always understand the legality aspect of it. One officer was saying, he almost read it like Miranda rights, like this canon will be used against you in court of law. And you're just like, no, that's Miranda. That's completely different. This is just the idea that it's discoverable. And so the patrol officers did not like asking this because it was like, they said every time we asked it, it was like an automatic no, which is not the case because I saw cases where they did bring up discoverability and the victim still completed the assessment. But I bring this up because it was a barrier to them not only documenting it, but informing the victim that it can be discoverable. This was the tech issues that I was describing. So this is a photo that I took. This was a pretty gnarly case where they actually had to send in a bite dog because of a suspect barricade. I also learned that domestic violence suspects love to barricade themselves in houses. In fact, I was surprised the number of SWAT call outs that are related to domestic violence is very interesting. But this is an issue of what would happen. And so the officer went through the lethality assessment and then he went to submit and he got this like error situation. And so then he had another officer redo the assessment. And, you know, fortunately the victim was able to answer the questions again. Even though you look at the situation, the victim absolutely did not want to answer those questions again. And then the second officer had the same issue. And so this goes back to the documentation aspect is that sometimes they would have these tech issues. And then other of the officers asked, like sometimes they wanted more information to put in to help the detectives and things like that. So they would say like, hey, the victim doesn't want to complete the lethality assessment, but the sister told me, like the sister said like, hey, if you call me later, like I will tell you everything that's going on about this and I can be a witness in this case and stuff. And so, and then sometimes they wanted to have, instead of like, yes, no, unknown, they wanted to have text boxes so that they could put in the context of it. So if they said yes to being strangled, they could put how many times, when it happened, did they call the police, like within each of those assessments so that context can be put with all the answers. But also what's really interesting about the role of technology, in addition to the tech issues, is that officers brought up the idea that documenting things on their phone kind of changes the dynamic. And so if any of you have been to the restaurants lately where it's like this, you basically just have food runners, you don't have servers anymore because everything's done on an iPad. You know, once someone brings out an iPad, kind of funnily changes the dynamic of the conversation. And officers brought this up, especially some of the newer officers. They were saying, I'm really passionate about domestic violence cases. I grew up in a home with domestic violence, so like I understand like kind of these dynamics. But it's like when I'm working with a victim, like I'm trying to build rapport, and then I just feel like it is weird that now all of a sudden I'm going to ask them questions based off my phone. And so one officer is saying like when I'm reading things off my phone, it makes me feel like I'm new to this. And then others, they say that the victim kind of gets a little bit more distant when I bring out the phone. And they also didn't like watching the officer document things in the phone. That was challenging for them in terms of like once they started documenting things and the victim was seeing that they were writing things down, it made the victim nervous. And some officers brought up that would generally get them to not want to answer any more of the questions. And so the second lesson is, in addition to developing buy-in with officers, we also have to have some standardization about how officers are implementing these lethality assessments. And so I would like to do a lot more work with advocates and communication specialists to see, what is the most trauma-informed way that we can, get this information, provide victims with enough information to make an informed decision, so that we're not re-traumatizing victims or further upsetting them in that way. And so some of the officers would bring up everything and they'd kind of have like a little elevator speech about, hey, this is what I'm doing and why I'm doing this. Also know that this information is discoverable and that it is completely voluntary, so you do not have to answer these questions. And then others wouldn't do that at all, and they would just go into asking the questions, or they would ask the questions throughout and then document them later. So again, we need to figure out better ways to figure out how to work with people that are in crisis, which is I think is great, because cross training with advocates and who are working with victims in crisis, they can provide us with some really great information, and it's great to kind of see other people model that trauma informed and victim centered approaches when they're working with victims. So now I kind of want to talk about some more of the quantitative aspects of the study of like when victims were most likely to decline participation in the lethality assessment. And so this goes to show that in order for these lethality assessments to be successful, like we have to have victim buy-in, and victims have a lot of legitimate reasons to not want to complete the screen or even talk to an advocate. One of which being the discoverability aspect of it. They don't want the offender to know that information. Other times the victims were mad that we were there, and so they didn't want to answer any of those questions. And then others, they were in shock. I remember this one case where this woman was strangled by her partner, but before she was strangled, she was making dinner for her kids, and so that was the only thing that she was focused on. And so the officer was trying to not only do the lethality assessment, but also a strangulation supplement. And the victim was just clearly in shock. You could see that she just like she wasn't being difficult or anything like that. She was just in shock, and all she kept saying is like, my kids need to eat, so I don't want to answer these questions. Like I need it. She's still focused on getting her kids fed, because that's what was going on before the strangulation happened. So these are all the different aspects that I looked at in terms of potential kind of situational factors that could influence a victim's decision to complete the assessment and or speak to an advocate. And so I looked at like, does this vary depending on when the call comes in? Does it vary based on the call type? Are victims more likely to participate if there's witnesses, if it was a third party that called it in? Same thing with the repeat serial victims. And then also parental status, things like that. So in terms of when victims refuse, I was able to do sorry, not that one. There we go. I was able to kind of do an analysis of when the time of day when victims were most likely to decline the lethality assessment. And so what we found was generally on the weekends, and generally during the evening times. And this actually translated because one of the main predictors of refusing participation was on the night shift. That was one of the stronger predictors. So basically anything after 11 p.m., victims they didn't want to answer those questions. And that could be because there's alcohol involved and it's craziness, or it's late in the night. Sometimes it's newer officers that maybe don't understand like why they're asking certain questions, and so there was something unique about the night shift influencing refusals in these calls. Go to the next one. Oh, geez, 1 second. You just stop touching things. Okay, so these were the correlates of when victims were most likely to decline. So that was the night shift on calls that were what they called verbal. So there was no probable cause for a crime. Nothing resulted in an arrest, no injuries, and no witnesses. And so the big takeaway from this is that it could be one of two things. One, it is the victim doesn't perceive the situation to be serious enough to provide the information, and or officers may not be perceiving the situation enough to encourage victims to participate. And so one thing that I'm looking at now is if there's an officer effect on this, but I don't have the results or any preliminary aspects of that yet. But in one case, so a lot of these are relating to the seriousness. So it's late at night. No one's getting arrested. There's no injuries. There's no witnesses, no independent witnesses, things like that. The victims were much more likely to decline during these calls. However, some officers mentioned that, even if they did decline, we would explain kind of like what we're doing and why we're trying to connect them to advocates. And if that's not something they want to do at this point, we still document it, and because we may have a future encounter with them. And so just because it was a verbal in one of the calls, officers recognize that they come across these victims, multiple times. And so sometimes they're not in a situation, they're not in a state to provide that information then, but they still wanted to make sure that they had a good interaction with the victim. So if not then maybe in the future, or maybe we inform them of the local advocacy center, and maybe that might be something that they seek out in the future. But generally, this kind of correlated a lot to like the seriousness of these situations. But just because either the victim doesn't see it as serious or the officer may not see it as serious, it's still important for them to educate why they're asking those questions, and also respecting victims' decision to participate in it because it is supposed to be voluntary. Um, so the refusals, we have to understand that victims are going to have legitimate reasons to decline. And that could be because they just don't want to get the information, the discoverability of it. It's late at night. And so we have to help officers understand that victims are going to decline, but that doesn't mean that this is going to be a difficult victim or they're refusing to participate or cooperate in that sense. I don't like to use the term cooperation because I like to use participation because ultimately, if we're going to be doing victim-centered approaches, that is really providing victims with enough information to make decisions. And so just help officers understand that like some are going to decline, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like they're doing anything wrong. But we do want officers to lead those interactions with the victim, knowing that with the victim, hopefully feeling that they can call at any time, and that they will respond whenever they need. So I also wanted to show you a little bit more about the high-risk victims. We're going to talk about this. What was interesting is that in this particular community, when they identified high-risk victims, it tended to cluster on certain days. And so in this community, they called it DV Sunday, where they said that that's where the officers perceived like that's when we have the most domestic violence calls. And interestingly enough, when I looked at it, it was actually on Sundays where they were more likely to identify high-risk victims. And so this officers describe this from a different perspectives in terms of they may not have called all weekend, even though they've been experiencing abuse and fights all weekend. And by Sunday, they're fed up and it's escalated, or now they're actually going to call the police. And so, like on Sundays, maybe there was more time to actually answer the questions and things like that. But the most common times that they were identifying the high risk victims were either from like 6 p.m. to midnight, but also during the noon kind of period of time. And when you actually look at kind of when they got the most calls for service, it was usually when people were home together. So it was early in the morning when they were getting kids ready for school. It was during lunch. And then it was like from 3 to later on when everyone's back in the home kind of thing. And so we started to see that these calls cluster in certain days and times. But in this particular community, the identification of the high risk victims were more likely on Sundays, Fridays, and Thursdays in that sense. These are just some differences in terms of who were the high risk victims. So many more of the identified high risk victims were female victims of male offenders. It was cases where victims had injuries, and the victim had had a prior arrest for domestic violence. Same thing with the items in the lethality assessment. So of the completed lethality assessments from the 900 victims or incidents, because some of these are the same victim. But this is just a breakdown showing you that generally the high-risk victims are scoring much higher on these lethality factors than those that are saying no to the questions, and officers are not identifying them as high-risk victims based off their belief. And so when we are getting a lot of yeses to these questions, we also have to understand that these victims are experiencing multiple behaviors at the same time. So they may say yes to a strangulation, but they may also are experiencing threats or property damage. They may have children in the home that their partner knows are not their biological children in that sense. Even more interesting, concerns for their partner's mental health. The high-risk victims were more likely to report that the partner had threatened a pet, and being in a gang. And so this is something that the DV detectives brought up in terms of participation that we have to take into consideration is that we may arrest the suspect and remove them from the scene, but the victim knows that that person is in a gang. So it doesn't matter if that person is arrested. That person is going to get the other gang members to intimidate the victim into not complying, getting them to recant their statement. And so some victims were saying no because their partner was in a gang, and they knew that there would be retaliation either from the partner or someone in the partner's gang. And we saw this a lot in the open-ended statements when when officers would ask, "Is there anything else that concerns you about your safety?" Retaliation from other gang members was a common theme that we found in that. And then additionally, we also saw significant differences in terms of the repeat victims and suspects. So when victims had multiple interactions with the police, they were also more likely to be identified as those high-risk victims based off their score. And so these are the themes that we found from analyzing the open-ended statements. Is there anything else that worries you about your safety? And so we definitely saw the main thing was escalation and additional physical violence. So the victim was concerned that this person was going to come back for them, that when they're arrested, it's just going to make things a lot worse because they're scared every day in their life. Stalking harassment was a big aspect of it, and also something that's important because a lot of these dangerous assessments are really only asking about kind of a surveillance aspect of it, which is only one aspect of stalking. Stalking is a pattern of conduct that causes fear and or substantial emotional distress, and so it's not just physical pursuit behaviors. It is also technology. It is also them trying to sabotage personal and professional relationships. And so most victims are going to identify physical surveillance as stalking, but we need officers and advocates to know that stalking is so much more, and that we are seeing it in victims' concerns for moving forward in terms of the victim is afraid that they're going to show up at their job, that they're never going to leave them alone, that they're going to start targeting their kids. Same thing, like concerns about children, that he's going to do something to my children, or, I have to take my kids to school tomorrow. And so I'm afraid that he's going to be waiting for me at the school. Partner mental health, this was a big issue. The victim saying that, I didn't want him arrested. I just want him to get help. This person is unstable. He's fine until he drinks. And so these are things that we've been hearing for centuries, but are like the legitimate concerns about the health aspects of their partners. And the retaliation was, like I said, a common thing. So related to gang members, he's made veiled threats. His family's going to come after me, these things like that. And so when we are working with these high-risk victims, we have to understand that the abuse does not stop once we make an arrest. In fact, we know from studies of jailhouse phone calls is that abusers are using not only they're using their phone calls to manipulate the victim, but if not, they are going to engage in what we call proxy stalking or proxy intimidation, where they are using someone else's PIN in the jail to disguise that they're contacting the victim. Or when I did some research with stalking cases, stalkers love to call their moms and then get their moms to convince the victim to drop the protection order or to recant the statement and things like that. So that's something that we need to pay attention to, is that when we are doing the lethality assessment, that victims have these additional concerns that we want to convey to advocates, so that advocates can incorporate those concerns into the safety planning aspects moving forward. All right. So in this particular community, I asked officers about their experiences connecting the high risk victims to advocates. And so in this community, the local advocacy center has worked with the agency for a while. This particular community has a very robust response to domestic violence. They have a domestic violence coalition that meets every month. They have a high risk domestic violence team. They're even starting a domestic violence court. And so this community absolutely cares about domestic violence, and pretty much working together to kind of best support victims. And so when I was talking to officers, they talked about how a lot of the victims don't know what an advocate is. And so simply just asking a victim, hey, do you want an advocate? Like, they don't know what that entails. And so it was interesting to hear how some of the officers would describe um, what an advocate is. And so a lot of them would say, hey, I have a friend that knows a ton of resources that can help you in ways that can address these concerns. So one officer was saying, like, so for example, like if you're concerned about your kids being able to go to school, we can set you up with the advocate and shelter in ways that we can get them to school. And so they're kind of being proactive in terms of addressing some of the victims' concerns, but framing them as a someone that knows all these resources that can provide additional help beyond what the officer can in that sense. Especially with the idea of community advocates and the confidentiality that goes with them. So this officer is saying this is someone who can help you if you need to relocate, and then we'll do it in a way where your kids can still go to the same school. I also asked officers about their relationships with the local advocates. And some of the newer officers, again, they didn't fully understand what advocates did, but then some of the more senior officers really kind of understood the value of what advocates bring, and kind of what their roles are versus their role. And they recognized that the advocates were important. And in this particular community, they didn't have many issues. Sometimes they would say, well, we would call the hotline, and sometimes they don't pick up, but I've never had a situation where they just never picked up. Like they will always call back, or we can get them in touch with them. And so they had a pretty good working relationship with the agency, which I also recognize is not common in a lot of communities, in that some communities may have community-based advocates that want nothing to do with the police. And so Colorado is going to start experiencing that now with this mandate of, having to do the lethality assessment and connect them to community advocates. And so some agencies are figuring out, what are we going to do? We don't even have community advocates. And so, but again, this just goes back to things that we've talked about since like the 1970s, is the importance of building relationships so that officers know what advocates do, and that advocates know what the limitations of officers' works are, and that they can work together to learn from each other about how to interact with victims. And so sometimes officers can come off very harsh and very by the book. And then when you watch advocates, how they interact with victims, like they have a certain finesse that I think a lot of officers can see, that would be benefit for officers to see and be able to model in terms of how they can kind of interact with victims that are in crisis. I'm going to go to this last part. Just to give you kind of a quick overview of this. So I was also interested in kind of the impact of these lethality assessments on the case moving forward. So I took a random sample of arrests. There's 200 of the arrests there. These are the demographics of it. Pretty much kind of mirror the general dynamics or demographics of the community. So out of the 200 arrests, there were 13% of cases where the charges were dismissed. They weren't in the, so basically what this shows and aligns with the research is generally when there is an arrest that happens, charges are usually filed relatively quickly after. About 1 in 5 of these were felonies. And so out of the 173 cases where prosecutors filed charges, most of them resulted in convictions. About 30% of them were dismissed. Others were deferred. So basically saying you have to abide by these conditions. If you're good for 2 years, then this gets dropped. And then in 8% of the cases, we didn't have an outcome because the charge was still pending. So I created this chart to get a better understanding of these are basically the top 5 of all of these decisions. So over on the left is the original trial, the top 5 charges that were filed in these cases, the top 5 most serious charges, the top 5 charges that resulted in a conviction, the top 5 serious charges that resulted in a conviction, and then the top 5 charges that were most likely to be dropped. And so this is really interesting. One, just goes to show that our felony level domestic violence cases are not the majority of our cases. The majority of our cases are these assault fours or these protection order violations or harassment. So, and when I say low level, I'm talking misdemeanor. I'm not talking about seriousness in that sense. But basically kind of these lower level misdemeanor cases are the bread and butter of domestic violence cases in this particular community. And what I found was that generally a lot of times the prosecutors tended to use the more serious charges as plea bargaining leverage. In fact, none of these, out of the 200 cases, none of these went to trial. There was 0 cases that actually went to trial. All of these were pled. All of the convictions were the result of a plea bargain. And one of the most common tactics that they used in this, which is very common, this is not, prosecutors do this all the time in terms of using more serious charges or charges that carry a certain punishment as leverage to get them to plead to a lower level misdemeanor domestic violence charge. But in some situations, they're doing this because if they say yes, or if they get like 3 or more convictions for domestic violence, then it becomes a more serious felony with more teeth. And so prosecutors are not necessarily always thinking about the charge that aligns with what happened. Sometimes they're thinking about what specific charge is going to give us the best bang for the buck in terms of holding this person accountable. And so, for example, the children's exposure, that was something that gets dropped a lot in these cases. And when I talked to detectives about that, they said that, well, in Washington, if you get convicted of children exposure to domestic violence, it's a mandatory minimum 30 days in jail. And so prosecutors could use that in terms of leverage, being like, listen, not only are you going to have a conviction on your record that says that you exposed a child to domestic violence, you're going to have to serve 30 days in jail. And so that was a very powerful charge that they would leverage to get them to plead to something else, or they would drop that charge in exchange for a plea for something else. So of the about half of those convictions, about 3/4 of them were sentenced to 1 or more days in confinement. This kind of just gives you kind of an overview of the average sentence. But just where's my thing? No trials, high severity. Cool. That's what I want to get to this part. So this is the big question that I had is, what happens in a case when a victim refuses to participate or complete that assessment? And what I found is that there was no differences in terms of cases where a victim refused in terms of the outcomes. And so in terms of charges filed, whether the case result in a conviction and whether or not the suspect was actually served time in jail. Where I did see the significant differences is if there was an assessment in general. So if there is a completed lethality assessment, those cases tend to result in more violent charges filed, no contacts ordered issued, and also firearms surrendered. And so these are the results of prosecutors or judges using these cases. But also, same for the high lethality cases, those are more likely to result in charges filed, convictions, and confinement. And so something that I always say with this is that at this point, we don't necessarily know if that's the result of the case actually having the lethality assessment, or by a case having a lethality assessment, officers are doing a better job with the investigation. So if they're identifying a high-risk victim, they may recognize either the severity of the case and may be more willing in terms of the language that they're using to not convince victims, but to help victims understand concerns for their safety. But also if they get a victim to complete the lethality assessment, they're likely asking follow-up questions or additional questions to get more information that prosecutors can use to file these charges. So basically, the good news is that, if a victim refuses, that it doesn't really have any impact on the outcome of the case. What does is just having that lethality assessment in general. So cases that have that lethality assessment were more likely to result in charges filed, landed conviction, and also confinement. But this was a really interesting finding, is that cases that did have the lethality assessment, those suspects spent a longer time in jail compared to those that didn't. So in cases that did have a lethality assessment that resulted in a conviction, they spent on average 33 days in jail, whereas those that did not, or the cases that didn't have the lethality assessment, was about 4 days. And so again, while the LAP is not designed for charging decisions, we need a lot more research to see how prosecutors are using these lethality assessments, if at all, and if they are, to make sure that they're doing it in a way that can still instill due process and things like that. But that's also why I want to figure out what defense attorneys think of these cases. So just kind of the main takeaway with this is that there are benefits to the lethality assessment, but we need better training and on how to implement these. And so oh no, it's not on here. Let me pull this up real quick. Lacey, did you want to talk about this?
talk about, we have lots of questions and I know we only have
Oh,
a few
sorry.
minutes. No, you're
I'm so sorry
good.
about that.
Um,
Sure.
Go ahead.
No, I was just it didn't save in the for
That's
the
okay.
summit.
No worries. We can just tell folks about it. So we did have somebody ask, did they complete the lap on domestic violence calls only? If so, does that only when someone is arrested or a family problem call as well?
Great question. So their protocol said that anytime the situation involved intimate partners. So they did not do it for every domestic violence call. And so there were some calls that we would go to where it was brothers in an argument. They wouldn't do the lethality assessment because the lethality assessment is designed for intimate partner homicide. So, and then they are required to do it regardless of whether or not there is probable cause for an arrest. So they didn't just do it when an arrest happened. They were supposed to do it during every call. And so sometimes we have a lot of situations that would be like a traffic stop where someone saw the couple arguing, they get into the car, we pull them over. And so even in that, because they're intimate partners, they have that current or former relationship, they share a child, officers would still have to do the lethality assessment. And so sometimes they're doing it on the side of the road, during a traffic stop. But so no, they did it in every call where there was a victim and an offender who were intimate partners. So not in the
Great.
domestics and not just as a result of an arrest.
Someone asked, did you consider failure to complete lap based on how much training the officer had received and how to ask the questions, or on whether the officers had the benefit of receiving training on trauma-informed interaction principles?
That's such a great question. No, I didn't connect to how much training because I didn't survey any of the officers. A lot of these were in focus groups and during the ride-alongs and then interviews with individual officers. And so when I asked about training, that's where they were giving more of the anecdotal aspects of it. But that is something that I definitely want to look in the future is that officer effect is, are there certain officers who do a better job at getting lethality assessments completed? Are there officers that struggle with it, trying to figuring out like what is that struggle and getting more information on it? But that's the thing too is we also don't really have a lot of great research on terms of like we have research that shows that the trauma informed trainings are effective for officers, but we need a lot more moving forward after those trainings and how they are taking the information they learned in those trauma informed trainings and putting it to practice and what are some of the challenges of that. And so that's also a great question and something we definitely need a lot more information about. It's something that I would like to look more into is that officer effect in terms of, because this, again, the information is based off how officers documented the case. And so is there an officer effect in terms of specific officers like documenting these cases when it becomes more serious because that's changing how they are approaching the victim? Or, or do we see we obviously saw differences in terms of the verbal calls. And so we need to understand more of that. Is that because the victim doesn't see it as serious? Is it the officer doesn't see it as serious? Both? Or is there something else going on there?
Right. Okay. One or two more. Was the refusal data looked at alongside? Oh, every time that someone puts something in the chat, it jumps back down. Hold on one second. So sorry. Was the refusal data looked at alongside the general data? Okay. Alongside the data for general call data, for example, does the high referral rate also correlate to the high volume of calls?
No, I did not. I did not look at that. Also, these are all calls that were tagged by the officers as intimate partner violence. So like I didn't have like so if it was like a burglary call, or if the call was burglary, it would still be tagged as an intimate partner situation because it involved intimate partners. And so that was the sampling frame that I used was anything that was tagged as an intimate partner violence call. So like I didn't compare that to like not like a non-domestic burglary that would happen because they wouldn't implement the lap in that situation. Does that answer that question?
I think so. Yeah. There are a lot of questions in the Q&A. There's a lot of stuff, and I don't know if you saw or not, but Dr. Campbell is on the call, and she jumped in for a little bit while you were out, logging off and logging back in. So there's been a lot of great conversations in the chat, and I think some stuff moving forward of us to connect. Someone asked if Dr. Campbell asked if the study is published, and if so, where?
Not yet. I am
No.
finishing the discussion in the first paper that's looking at the victim participation. And then the second one is that I'm working on is looking at the repeat victims. And so I'm looking at how scores vary every time they complete it, and whether or not repeat victims are more or less likely to participate with each encounter. So, but once I get those published, I will be informing you of that, and getting that out when I can. So
Great.
potentially next year there will be more information from this.
Wonderful. Hey, Patrick, will you do me a favor and put your email in the chat? So if anybody has a question that we did not get to, please email us, or I don't know if you don't mind putting your email in the chat, if folks would be willing to reach out. You will be receiving an email with a survey that once you complete the survey, will connect you to your certificate for today. Thank you again. It looks like there's a lot of demand for lethality assessment webinars, so we will definitely be chatting to try to get some more stuff scheduled soon. And if you are not aware, we have a conference coming up in South Padre Island, Texas in September. It is geared towards rural and resort communities. It's called the Conference on Crimes Against Women Summit. It's September 28th and 29th, and registration is open now. It's a much smaller venue and a smaller group. So it's 2 days. We'd love to see you there. And also just got an email today that request for proposals for CACA 2027 is open. So if you wanted to try to put in a proposal, do that as well on our website. And the recording for this presentation will be put on the Institute CCR websites, hopefully by early next week. So I think that's it. And yes, if you'll go to our website, conferencecaw.org, you can get more information about Summit. We'll hang tight for just a minute. Thank you for putting that in there, Patrick. We'll hang tight for just a second if anybody has any additional questions. Otherwise, we'll see you guys next month. Thank you.